Phil and I will take you there. We're going to do a Wesley Heritage Tour in England. And then just for fun, we're going to go to Paris and Normandy at the end of the trip. And so there are brochures available in the church office, and or talk to me or Phil, either one, about the trip. And we would be happy to share that with you. But anyway, you could go and be there too with that. Today, as you can see, I'm getting a lot of feedback. Andy, I don't know if there's anything to do with that. I don't think I need it either. There we go. I don't need it. So we'll do that. As you can see on the slide here, this passage that we're going to cover this weekend in worship actually has three components to it. First of all is for the third time, Jesus reminds and shares with the disciples, this is what's going to happen to the Son of Man. This is what's going to happen coming down the pike. And so we'll look at that. Then Jesus heals a blind beggar near Jericho. And this is on that trip we're talking about, going from the Galilee all the way to Jerusalem with that. And then that's near Jericho. And then in Jericho, we'll have Jesus and Zacchaeus touching base with each other there. So we're going to start first of all with Luke 18, 31 through 34. Then he took the 12 disciples aside and said to them, "See, we are going to Jerusalem, and everything there that is written about by the Son of Man, by the prophets, will be accomplished. For he will be handed over to the Gentiles, and he will be mocked and insulted and spat upon. After they have flogged him, they will kill him, and on the third day he will rise again." Pretty heavy stuff. He's reminding them again, this is what's ahead. But they understood nothing about all these things. In fact, what he said was hidden from them, and they did not grasp what was said. And so that's one of those interesting things. First of all, we have Jesus with the disciples. They're heading towards Jerusalem, and it would be no surprise to them that that's where they're going. It's one of those things that is Passover time. They traditionally go to Jerusalem at Passover, and they would start heading down from the Galilee, the usual routes that they would take to get there. It's kind of like taking your dog to the veterinarian. You get in the car, and it doesn't take a couple of turns before the dog starts to react a little bit, because they know where they're going with that. And so it's the same with vacations or whatever. We have the usual places that we go. We have the usual places that we stop. So it really wouldn't have been a surprise, and it's not a quick trip, if you're walking to the disciples. But he states again, this is where we're going, and when we're going to. So he's emphasizing to them at this particular time the aspects concerning what's going to happen to him. He'll be handed over to the Gentiles. He'll be mocked. He'll be insulted and spat upon. And this is in the scriptures that we see coming from Isaiah, and we'll talk about that in a second. But it also is based on history. If you've been around, you know that the Romans, this is their primary way of torturing. This is their primary way of making an example of individuals. And so what is happening and going to happen is pretty well known and documented by folks. The Romans had crucifixion down to a science, and they knew how to prolong it. They knew how to make it the most painful way they can make it. And so they have this happening, and Jesus is telling them, here's where we're heading with that. And so this is the third time that Jesus tells them. And there's two other times in Luke that we do that. In fact, in Matthew, the writer of the gospel actually has four occurrences where just they mention the fact this is where we're heading. In Mark, there's 3. In Luke, there's 3. And then in John, interestingly, John kind of spatters it along the way. There's multiple times that that John makes comments in very subtle ways, not quite as direct as we do in the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But in John, he just kind of drops little hints along the way in a very subtle way that this is what's going to happen. So in all of the gospels, we have the mention of this. But we also know that this is part of the ritual that goes to crucifixion for the Romans is total humiliation. Whatever we can do to totally break not only the body, but the spirit of the individual. Humiliation in as many ways as we can think to do it. And it's a very calculated, very, very difficult thing with that. And that leads then to obviously being on the cross and what that means in death and in dying with that. So we know that's coming. And then we have, for some reason, it's not revealed yet to the disciples. They didn't really fully understand that Jesus is still the one. And I think it's interesting in the gospel here, the implication of, is this something God has created, or is this something that they just don't get with that? And they did not grasp it. It was hidden from them. Well, how's it hidden? And in what way is it hidden from them? Why do they not understand and get it? Now, if we go to the next slide, Andy, you remember here, we've seen this kind of slide before, and that is the different ways for people to get from the Galilee down to Jerusalem. And you can remember that the 3 different paths, starting at Capernaum, which is the home base of the disciples and Jesus. Capernaum was Peter's home. Is where he's living with his family. His mother-in-law has a house there, right a block from the synagogue that is there, that Jesus is famous for going into and speaking. And so that's where we begin the journey. But there's a couple of ways, 3 ways to get there in general. These are all trade routes that are from the Galilee. The Galilee is a very prosperous area. We'll see in a few minutes, especially because of the fishing industry that is there. But they're pretty well off. And Zopori, which is there, Sepphoris, is the city capital for the Roman government in the Galilee. And so you have that influence right there in the immediate area. You see Nazareth, and from Nazareth to Capernaum is 20 miles. So you see, again, it's a fairly tight area there. It's mountainous at this point, going from Nazareth into the Galilee. And if you remember, the Sea of Galilee is 700 feet below sea level. So it's one of those very interesting things. If you go online, look at some maps, topography wise, you have the Mediterranean Sea at sea level. You've got some mountains you got to get over, and then you've got the Sea of Galilee 700 feet below the Mediterranean Sea, what is there. And so it's an interesting area. So climbing out of the Sea of Galilee into then the pass that there, the Arbel Pass is the pass that was used to go from Nazareth over into the basin of the Sea of Galilee. So anyway, they come down, and they can go one of several ways. Now, we've talked before about the primary way that people would usually go is this red line here. Folks would come down, again, if you're an Orthodox Jew, you would avoid going through Samaria because of the challenge of that relationship. And you'll come down and you go by Mount Tabor, and then you go down and cross over the Jordan River. And that was their way of getting around Samaria, is just, you know, you ever heard about just go to the other side of the street? Well, this is kind of what they're doing. To avoid encountering somebody or avoid encountering a specific place, you cross the street to the other side. And that's what they're doing here. They're crossing the river to go what is now Jordan here. And so they cross over, go down, and then they cross back over there at Jericho, which is just north of the Dead Sea, which you can see down here at the bottom, and cross over there. And then you have from Jerusalem, you have 16 to 18 miles uphill the whole way. So we're going to hear them talk about going up to Jerusalem. You can't get to Jerusalem from any direction without going up. It is up on the mountain, and that's of course why it was picked. It was very strategically, both militarily, but also because of the oasis was there, all those kinds of things that are needed there. But Jericho is there. The other way is the Mediterranean way, which is that green line or blue on the other side. And so you would go down the Jezreel Valley, and then down by the Mediterranean Sea, Caesarea, you can see there is where, oh shoot, what's the city that's there? Tel Aviv is there. That's where Jaffa and Tel Aviv and that whole area is there at Caesarea. That is where Herod had his palace on the Mediterranean. So it too was a very prosperous area. You would go down there and then cross over. But the way that Jesus has chosen to go, because he has set his sights on Jerusalem, is then through the middle of Samaria, which is that white line. That's the quickest way to get there. It's just straight down from that point on. So anyway, we have Jesus choosing to go that way, and they would have known, again, as you're going to Passover, you start in the Galilee, in that area, in the northern part of Israel, and you would head south, and the farther along you go, the bigger your caravan gets. Is like you just, you know, you've done those kind of trips before. You start up here, you pick somebody up, and you pick these people up, and some of them are relatives and some of them are friends. You do the same trip every year. You look forward to seeing the same people. You see, oh my gosh, how you've grown. You know, the children are growing up. They're becoming more mature with that. People are getting older. People that used to make the trip are not here anymore. And so you just kind of get that feel of the caravan heading south, and everybody would have been. So hundreds and hundreds of people would have traveled together, going from the north, and the farther you go and the closer you get. And then when you get to Jericho, this point is kind of like the interstate highway heading to Jerusalem. Everybody would be coming from different directions. They would all get to Jericho, and they would all go up to heaven, to Jerusalem, which was like heaven for them. And so all along the way, you've got this throng of people that's growing and growing and growing, and the disciples are becoming a part of that. So going through Jericho at this point would have been a very, very busy time. There would have been all kinds of people along the way. And in the case of today, we're going to see the story here of this beggar. And it would have not been unusual to have people, like every other kinds of major event that you have, that's kind of coming from different locations seeking help and assistance. But we also know that Jesus is set his sights on Jerusalem. He knows what's coming, both by prophecy, but also experience. And so he's getting there. And even in the midst of that, in this story, we have Jesus set his sights on Jerusalem. He's trying to get there. He's going through the middle of Samaria to get there as quickly as he can. But yet along the way, he still ministers to people. Amazing thing. He still had time for people along the way. And that's part of what we'll experience today. One of the things, going to the next slide, we know is that one of the things that's mentioned in this passage is that he's going to be flogged. That was a normal thing again. And part of the calculation of the Romans is that we try to get the crucifixion finished as quickly as possible. It's not something they want sometimes to do, but also sometimes they draw it out farther and farther. And so they have this technique that they do. And part of the flogging is for you to lose a lot of blood, for you to become weak and weak, but yet you still, with that, and we've talked before about the 39 slashes that you have. Why 39? Because 40 would kill you. And so not only do they flog you, but they also make it extremely painful. And one of the ways they do is the variety of whips that they would have used. These would have been the leather strips. They would have had bones and nails and kind of like barbed wire attached to them, so that as they flogged you, part of it is to rip the flesh away with that. And so it's a very difficult thing. And that's part of the suffering that we see Jesus doing on behalf of us. But for Jesus, part of what he is anticipating is the reality that people are going to turn away. People are going to leave him. They're going to be disloyal to him. People that have been friends, people that have been followers will fall away. There'll be injustice. There'll be deliberate insults, humiliation, physical pain along the way. And all those things are done to humiliate, to be public and to humiliate you as best you can. And then the next slide, we see, historically we have had related to the church what we call the Latin cross. That is the cross that's here, and then has the cross being about 3/4 of the way up. And for those of you from the Catholic tradition, we have what we call a crucifix. And at that point, Jesus is still hanging on the cross. That's important to the Catholic tradition. Our cross is empty, that we use in the Protestant church, signifying that Christ has already risen. It is an empty cross. But it reminds us of that. But most of the time, the cross that was used during the time of the Romans was actually a tau cross, a T, a capital T kind of cross. And they would have that along the way. And you can see here a drawing with that. But the patibulum, which is the cross beam, as you can see in the drawing here, is what Jesus would have carried. In many of our traditions, we have Jesus carrying a full cross, a full Latin cross. Most of the time, what was tradition in the time of the Romans would have been a tau cross. And the stipe, which is the main beam here in the middle, would have just stayed there. And all they would have done is carried then the cross beam that is across that. Now, in itself, that's usually between 100 and 125 pounds or somewhere in that vicinity. And so you would be tied to it initially to carry it. And so you would be carrying this 100-pound beam across your shoulders. You've already been flogged. You have been, given really very little to eat and very little to drink, other than just enough to keep you alive. And so you would walk away. And of course, as you're carrying this beam, you would be attached to it. And so the ability to walk and to carry that at this condition would be very difficult. And so when you would fall, what's to break your fall? Nothing. There's no way to stop yourself from falling if you do. And in Jesus's case, we've seen the tradition where Simon of Cyrene would have been the one, in history, the tradition is he was the one that was said, Jesus can't carry this for himself, so we're going to inscript you to do that for him. And so the other thing that's interesting too, we often have the image that Jesus is on a cross high above everybody else. Most of these crosses, once you're fixed in place, is somewhere between 6 to 8 feet off the ground, because that's part of the humiliation, is you're very close to people. They can hurl insults at you. The soldiers can do whatever they want to you. You're easily accessible with that. So he would have done that. The stipes itself, the stipe in the center part, as I said, would have stayed there, and you would just been lifted up then and placed on the top. There would have been a notch there to hold you in place, but they would have done that. You'll notice that also there's the footrest and or seat is added later on. Initially that was not, and it was actually at a time that did it. But part of that is, again, we often see the crucifix of Jesus with both feet together. There's also evidence in the Roman crucifixions. Archaeologically, they have found nails that have been used actually through the heels of the person with each on each side of the stipe versus on top of one another, as we've often seen in crucifixions. And also they would bend your legs so that you couldn't really support yourself. You know, there's really nothing to support yourself there. And so, and if crucifixion went on to the point that they needed to have it over before Passover, then they would often break your legs. And as a way of doing that, you had to find a way to breathe. And asphyxiation was usually one of the forms of death in this, is because you just can't breathe. You can't pick yourself up. So it's really gruesome, isn't it? I mean, it's, what a gift Jesus Christ gives to all of us by what he endured for all of us. But all of that's on there and heading there. And then the prophecy that we see, you know, I mentioned again, we'll go to the next slide. This there it comes from this is the one that most of the time is referred to as the 53rd chapter of Isaiah, and the suffering servant, the servant who has come to serve us, but to suffer on our behalf. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. So this is the prophecy, the foretelling of that. Now then, moving on, we'll go ahead and moved on. We have the next story. So the first one is the proclamation. Once again, this is what's going to happen. So they're en route on the way to Jerusalem, and Jesus is reminding them again, this is what we're going to anticipate. But then the next story here that we have is the one where we have the blind man. We're getting closer to Jericho, and as he approached Jericho, not there yet, but on the way, a blind man was sitting by the roadside begging. A lot of time in other places in the scripture, Mark is the one that tells us this is Bartimaeus. Luke does not give us the name of the individual, but because of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are from the same source of Mark, the general assumption is this is the same story of the tradition of Bartimaeus. A blind man was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard a crowd going by, he asked what was happening. They told him, Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. Then he shouted, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Those who were in front sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he shouted even more loudly, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus stood still and ordered the man to be brought to him. And when he came near, he asked him, what do you want me to do for you? He said, Lord, let me see again. So the implication here is that at one time he had sight in his life. Jesus said to him, receive your sight, your faith has saved you. Immediately he regained his sight and followed him, glorifying God, and all the people, when they saw it, praised God. This is a very traveled road. We've talked about that already as he's approaching that. He can't see, but he can hear. And I think that's an interesting image that we're going to have is that Bartimaeus, the blind man, can't see, but he can hear. And he can hear what's going on. And he asked for Jesus to have mercy upon him. And mercy is that gift that is given to us that is undeserved, unexpected, so to speak. And so he's asking for mercy. So it's interesting too, there's different forms of this study. In Matthew 9, there's actually 2 blind men, and Jesus heals them by touching their eyes. In Mark 8 and John 9, there's a healing that takes place at Bethsaida. And that's where, if you remember, Jesus takes the dirt and spits and makes mud and puts it on their eyes. But here, the blind man at Jericho, in Mark 10, Matthew 20, and Luke 18, all Jesus has to do is say, your faith is what's made you whole. It's your faith that has brought you to this place. Your faith is what has made the difference. And for that reason, you can see. And Jesus makes this guy whole again in a way that he did it because he asked, and this was what was asked for. And so I think it's interesting. If we go on to the next slide, then it's all based on faith with that. Receive your sight. Your faith has made you well. It was faith that wanted Jesus. It was faith that caused this person to say, I know you're the one that can help. And he's been begging. And maybe he's asked this of a lot of people over time. Have mercy on me. Help me. Do something to make my life better. It was faith that knew who Jesus was. He knew who Jesus was because of his faith. It was faith that knew that what the man deserved from Jesus because of his faith. It was faith that could tell Jesus what the man wanted. It was faith that could call Jesus Lord in the scripture. And then the final story that we're going to have here today is the one about Zacchaeus, which is one of my favorite stories. And I've mentioned it in sermons, and I've written about it in devotions and things like that about the significance of this story, at least for me. With that, he's entered Jericho. Now he enters Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. And interestingly, the word Zacchaeus, the name Zacchaeus means pure one. But it's interesting, at what point is he pure? He's been given the name. This is the life that he is living. Was he pure before he became a tax collector? Is he pure after he became a tax collector and Jesus encountered him? Where does the name come from with that? But he was the chief tax collector and was rich. This is the only place in the scriptures that we hear a chief tax collector. I don't know the significance of this for the gospel writer, but this is the only place there's even any mention about a chief tax collector. There's tax collectors all over, but why here is this one the chief of the tax collectors? He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus. Interesting. He hasn't been introduced to him yet. How did he know who Zacchaeus was? He called him by name. And it's really implication here, I think. He calls him by name to say, I know who you are. I know you, and I claim you, even though others might not. But Zacchaeus, when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and called him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and say, he has gone to be with the guest of the one who is a sinner. Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay him back 4 times as much. Then Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. He's one of us, folks. You ridiculed him, but yet he still has the family lineage, the family heritage. For the Son of Man came to seek out and save the lost. You know, this story, I think, again, is interesting. He's on the way to do his work, but yet his work is not finished with the people that he encounters. So he has this encounter with Zacchaeus. Just a quick few pictures here of Jericho. This is Tells Jericho. Interestingly, Jericho, by tradition, is the oldest city in the world. Somewhere around 11,000 years ago, this area was settled. You can see this is one of 22 ancient cities that is at Jericho. This is one of the archaeological digs that is there. But one of the things that you'll notice is all the green around here. Jericho is famous for the springs that are there. And this is known, the primary spring that is there, the biggest one, the one that is life-giving to this area, is known as Elisha's spring. In the story in 2 Kings, the 2nd chapter, the 19th through the 22nd verses, we have the story of them coming to this area, and Elisha is with them, and they say, this area would be great to settle, but the water is no good. The water is a lot of water, but it's not good. And so the story is Elisha asks for a jar of salt, and he throws the jar of salt into the water, and he says, okay, now it's clean. And ever since then, it's been pure water at Jericho. This is a major spring, and it actually supplies water to this whole area. And even today, 900 homes have all the water they ever need out of this one spring that is there. And I think I remember, and some of you that have been with me, maybe you can remember, but my memory is 10,000 gallons of water, fresh water, every hour that comes from this spring. And so it's just amazing with that. This is also known as Prophet's Fountain. It's also known as Elijah's Fountain. If you go to downtown Jericho today, you'll see this here. It's again dating back 8,000 BC, so 10,000, almost 11,000 years ago. Jericho is known as the city of palms, and you can see all the palm trees. If you go to the next slide here, folks, we're in the wilderness. We're at the beginning of the desert here, and you have this huge oasis that is there with that. And so you have that. There's a pumping station that helps keep the water flowing with that. But it's just right on the verge of the next slide. This is at Jericho. This is the Mount of Temptation. By tradition, it is in the wilderness between Jerusalem and Jericho that Jesus spent the 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness. By tradition, this is the Mount of Temptation where Satan takes Jesus to the mountaintop and says, you know, everything that you can see forever and ever is yours, if only you'll just bow down to me. And the interesting thing about this is beginning of the wilderness that really, as we've seen before in pictures, looks kind of like the landscape of the moon in some ways. It's just very mountainous, very desolate in ways. And it's Jesus spending 40 days and 40 nights above the city of Jericho. By tradition, these caves that are up there is where Jesus spent his time. And he's overlooking one of the richest oases in the whole part of the world that they're part of. So he is fasting by tradition, but he's overlooking vegetation. He's overlooking fresh water. Some of the largest grapefruits and the largest oranges I have ever seen are in Jericho. I mean, it's just amazing, the fresh vegetables and the fruit that is there, the palm dates, all of that is there. And it's all there within grasp. And Jesus is above it, looking down upon it by tradition with that. And then the final picture here is the sycamore tree that Zacchaeus climbed. But that's the tradition. This is the tree that everybody stops at, is a representative, you know, one of the things that we have, and there are actually trees in the Garden of Gethsemane in Jerusalem that date back 1,500, 2,000 years because of the grafting that is done. You know, we kind of laugh at the fact that this is the tree that Zacchaeus climbed. But trees, because of grafting and the ability to continue life, it's not unusual to have a tree in this part of the world that actually is almost eternal. I mean, it's amazing the ability to do that agriculturally. But this is the place that everybody stops to remember this story in Jerusalem or in Jericho with that. But the story goes from here, and that's what we'll look forward to as we get closer and closer to Easter. The questions that we have today, and I guess we'll just divide up by taking your chairs in small groups of 3s and 4s and 5s and go to other places. But when you're in your life, when in your life have you felt that the meaning of God's word has been hidden from you? Was that your own doing, or is that something that God waited till a time? You know, one of the things we find in the scriptures a lot is Jesus does something miraculous and then says to the people around, shh, don't tell anybody. You know, so there's times that maybe it's a timing issue. Maybe it's a time that's not quite right yet. And maybe that's what God has planned as we have the hiddenness there. If Jesus asked you today the simple question, what do you want me to do for you? If he asked you today, what do you want me to do? What would you tell him? What have you told him today? And why do you think people responded differently to Jesus's friendship with Zacchaeus than they did with the healing of the blind man, Bartimaeus? You see a little bit of a difference here in how they felt about those two guys. How were they both healings? You know, what is it that happens in the life of Bartimaeus, the blind man, as well as in Zacchaeus? What healing takes place in him? And where in your life does Jesus first find you? Where did he find you? And were you up a tree? Did he invite himself to come to your home? One of the things that I always appreciate about this story, and I know it's kind of like going to the mountaintop. For me, Zacchaeus climbing this tree was the ability to climb and get above all the junk in his life and to be able to see Jesus. Without climbing the tree at times in our lives, you know, how do we see Jesus Christ? But yet in the midst of that, we also are invited to come down. We don't stay in the tree. We don't stay on the mountaintop. Jesus said to us, we need to come down and we need to follow him. So we do that too. So anyway, disperse yourselves among the room.
Center route, which you showed on the map, doesn't go from Jericho, does it?
No.
So did they make it? You made a diversion then, or?
Well, who knows? But you would still, again, depending on which way he's going with that. Jericho